The tragic legacy of isolation, the Blackwood story. Twins with extreme deformities. What are the consequences when siblings marry each other? The biological results of consanguineous unions remain one of humanity's most disturbing historical chapters, especially when they span multiple generations. In the state of West Virginia, deep within the Appalachian Mountains, a community existed that time seemed to forget. The year was 1937. The nation was still struggling to recover from the Great Depression. And while major urban centers were beginning to show signs of economic revitalization, the isolated valleys and steep slopes of the Appalachians remained a world apart, where families continued to live by traditions dating back generations. The Blackwood family was one such lineage. Established in that region since the late 18th century, when the first European settlers ventured through the Appalachian Range, the Blackwoods were characterized by their self-imposed isolation. As decades passed, while other families migrated to cities seeking opportunities, the Blackwoods stayed put, effectively turning into a genetic island within the mountains. A genetic island in the Appalachians. The Blackwood clan was always regarded with suspicion by residents of neighboring towns, reports Dr. Thomas Harrison, a historian at the University of West Virginia, who dedicated decades to studying isolated communities in the region. They rarely descended from the mountain, only coming down to trade essential supplies for furs and crafts. Marriages within the family became a usual practice, not by conscious choice, but due to geographical and social inevitability. The Blackwood property was a closed world. The sole access was a winding, treacherous dirt road, making visits infrequent, particularly during the harsh mountain winters. The main house, a two-story wooden structure built by the original patriarch, Isaiah Blackwood, had been enlarged over the years to accommodate the growing family. Small cabins housing the various family branches were built around it, forming a miniature family settlement. Sarah and Joseph Blackwood were first cousins who married in 1915. Like so many other family members before them, this union seemed perfectly normal. For them, it was merely the continuation of a family pattern. The couple's initial children were born without obvious issues, although some displayed slightly below average height and minor learning difficulties. It was in 1929, at the start of the Great Depression, that Sarah gave birth to twins, Eleanor and Edward. From the moment of birth, it was clear that something was amiss. The local doctor, who seldom visited the community, was urgently summoned. What he witnessed left him profoundly disturbed, as recorded in his medical diary discovered decades later. "I have never witnessed such deformities in newborns. The children exhibit severe cranial malformations with disproportionately large heads. Their upper limbs are underdeveloped, and both seem incapable of normal sucking. I fear they will not survive more than a few days. I strongly suspect the cause lies in the consanguineous union of the parents, compounded by previous generations of marriages between close relatives. The onset of genetic catastrophe." Contrary to all medical expectations, Eleanor and Edward lived. In the subsequent years, they showed severe developmental delays, failing to reach basic milestones such as speaking, crawling, or sitting. Their bodies remained fragile and underdeveloped, while their heads continued to grow abnormally. The condition of the Blackwood twins was probably a severe form of hydrocephalus combined with other genetic anomalies resulting from prolonged consanguinity, explains Dr. Melissa Carter, a geneticist at Johns Hopkins University. When close relatives have children, the probability of harmful recessive genes manifesting drastically increases. In the case of multiple generations of consanguineous marriages, these effects can become devastating. The birth of the twins marked a turning point for the Blackwood family. Sarah fell into a deep depression, unable to accept her children's condition. Joseph, for his part, retreated further into isolation, prohibiting all contact between the family and the outside world. It was against this backdrop of extreme isolation that an event occurred, an event that would forever change the fate of the Blackwood family. It was something so disturbing that it remained a whispered secret for decades in neighboring communities. The twins, now 8 years old in 1937, required continuous care. Being unable to communicate or walk, they were entirely dependent on their relatives. The situation created mounting tension within the family, particularly between Sarah and Joseph. Arguments grew increasingly frequent and intense. That fateful January night. On a particularly cold January night, as a snowstorm further isolated the property, an argument between the couple escalated to unprecedented levels. Screams echoed through the main house, waking other family members. "This isn't natural. Look at them. Look at what we've done," Sarah was heard shouting, according to later reports from one of the couple's nephews. The next morning, when the storm finally subsided, a scene of horror greeted the family. Sarah had vanished, and so had the twins. Fresh tracks in the newly fallen snow led only to the edge of a nearby cliff. What exactly happened that night remains one of the darkest episodes in Blackwood family history and a tragic testament to the devastating consequences that decades of consanguineous marriages can produce. Make sure you're already subscribed to this channel. The truth about isolated family lineages in rural America is being revealed here with scientific and historical details you won't find anywhere else. Your subscription is essential for us to continue investigating these cases that history tried to forget. The Blackwood family story neither began nor ended with the tragedy of Sarah and her twin children. To fully comprehend what led to that fateful winter night in 1937, we must go back even further in time and examine how this pattern of consanguinity and isolation was formed. The founder's paranoia. Patriarch Isaiah Blackwood arrived in the Appalachian Mountains in 1792, fleeing accusations of heterodox practices in New England. A suspicious and taciturn man, Isaiah believed the outside world was corrupt, and only through isolation could his family maintain what he termed spiritual and physical purity. Isaiah Blackwood was a classic example of a leader who employed isolation as a tool of control, explains Dr. Rebecca Johnson, an anthropologist specializing in closed communities. Historical archives suggest he had already been expelled from 3 different communities before finding refuge in the mountains, always for imposing extreme views on family segregation. In his personal notes, discovered only in the 1970s in a hidden chest in the main house, Isaiah wrote, "Our lineages must remain pure, without mixing with outsiders. The strength of our blood depends on it." This distorted view was passed down to subsequent generations as an unquestionable dogma. By the 3rd generation, the Blackwoods rarely married people from outside the family. Marriages between cousins became the norm, and occasionally, even closer unions took place. Problems began to manifest gradually. In the 1850s, local documents mentioned that Blackwood children exhibited worrying peculiarities, including smaller statures, cognitive difficulties, and vision problems. However, the family attributed these problems to divine trials or curses, never questioning their matrimonial practices. Cumulative effects. What we're witnessing here is a classic instance of how isolation can lead to genetically dangerous practices, states Dr. Howard Miller, a geneticist at Princeton University. The effects of consanguinity are cumulative. A single generation of a union between cousins might have minimal effects. But when this is repeated over 5, 6, or 7 generations, the risk of serious genetic anomalies increases exponentially. Returning to Joseph and Sarah Blackwood, first cousins and direct descendants of 6 generations of consanguineous marriages, the stage was set for a genetic catastrophe. When Sarah became pregnant for the 3rd time in 1928, she had already given birth to 2 children who showed mild signs of the effects of consanguinity: Michael, who had 6 fingers on each hand, and Ruth, who presented learning difficulties. The twins' pregnancy was exceptionally difficult. Sarah suffered from severe nausea throughout the gestational period and gained very little weight. The delivery, which occurred during a snowstorm that prevented the doctor's arrival, was assisted solely by older women in the family. Eleanor was born first, followed by Edward 20 minutes later. The shock was immediate. Genetic complementarity. Besides disproportionately large heads, the babies presented multiple deformities. Their lips had fissures, their eyes were widely spaced, and their hands had fused fingers. Even more unsettling was the fact that the twins appeared to mirror each other. Eleanor had more pronounced deformities on the right side of her body, while Edward presented them on the left side. This is a phenomenon known as genetic complementarity, particularly concerning in twins born from consanguineous unions, explains Dr. Carter. It's as if the compromised genetic material was distributed between the 2 fetuses, creating mirrored patterns of malformations. It's extremely rare, but well documented in medical literature, especially in genetically isolated populations. As the twins grew, their conditions became more challenging. At 3 years old, they still couldn't sit without support. At 5, they hadn't developed comprehensible speech, although they seemed to understand simple commands. Most disturbing was the extraordinary bond between them. When separated, even if only by a wall, they became extremely agitated, emitting distressing screams until they were reunited. This type of connection between monozygotic twins is already common in healthy pairs. But in cases of compromised neurological development, it can manifest in even more intense ways, observes Dr. William Tennant, a pediatric neurologist who studied the few medical records of the Blackwood twins decades later. Reports suggest that Eleanor and Edward possibly shared a type of nonverbal communication that other family members did not understand. The burden of care. The twins' condition gradually deteriorated. At 7 years old, Edward began having frequent seizures. Eleanor developed severe scoliosis that further impaired her already limited mobility. The burden of caring for them fell primarily on Sarah, as Joseph spent increasingly more time away, hunting in the mountains or working in the family fields. A distant cousin, Daniel Blackwood, who occasionally visited the property to bring supplies, left a disturbing account in his personal diary, dated November 1936, "I visited Joseph and Sarah today. The situation worsens each time I come. The children are larger, more difficult to carry, but equally dependent. Sarah looks like a ghost of herself. Her eyes are sunken, empty. When I tried to talk about taking the twins to a specialist in Charleston, Joseph exploded with anger. No outsider will lay hands on my children," he shouted. "I fear for what might happen in that house." The closest neighbors, the Patterson family, who lived about 5 kilometers away, reported hearing screams coming from the Blackwood property with increasing frequency in the winter of 1936 to 1937. On one occasion, Martha Patterson found Sarah wandering alone in the forest, talking to herself incoherently. She was repeating something about cleansing the blood and ending the suffering. Martha later reported, "I tried to take her home, but she refused my help. I should have insisted more. Perhaps I could have prevented what happened afterward." The aftermath of tragedy. The fateful winter of 1937 was one of the most severe ever recorded in the Appalachian Mountains. Successive snowstorms further isolated the already reclusive Blackwood family. It was in this context of extreme isolation, unbearable psychological pressure, and without any external support that disaster became inevitable. The morning after Sarah and the twins disappeared dawned clear and cold. The snow had ceased, leaving an immaculate white layer covering the Blackwood property. It was Joseph's younger brother, Thomas, who first noticed the tracks in the snow leading from the main house toward the cliff known as Devil's Leap, a precipice with more than 80 m of free fall to the rocky river below. "Something's wrong," Thomas said upon finding his brother in the kitchen. "Sarah and the children aren't in the house, and there are footprints going to the cliff." What followed was a frantic search. Joseph, Thomas, and 2 cousins followed the tracks in the snow. They were clearly visible and not difficult to follow, a set of adult footprints accompanied by drag marks, indicating that Sarah had either dragged or carried the incapacitated twins. The tracks ended abruptly at the edge of the cliff. There were no signs of a struggle, just an area where the snow had been compacted, as if someone had stood there for some time. "She stood here," Joseph murmured, kneeling in the snow. "She stood here looking down." The search for the bodies began immediately, but conditions were almost impossible. The river was partially frozen, its banks snow-covered, and the steep terrain made descent extremely dangerous. It was only 3 days later that they found the first body, little Edward, trapped between rocks about half a kilometer downstream. His body was remarkably preserved by the cold, his eyes open, staring at the grey winter sky. Eleanor's body was found the next day, further away, almost entirely covered by snow on the riverbanks. Sarah's last words. Sarah remained missing for another 2 weeks. When they finally found her, it was a shock to everyone. Her body wasn't on the riverbanks or in the river, but in a small cave on the face of the cliff, about 20 m below the top. Somehow, she had survived the initial fall, dragging herself to the shelter of the cave, where she finally succumbed, likely due to a combination of exposure to extreme cold and injuries. Most disturbing was what they found with her, a diary, protected in a waterproof bag, containing her last words. The pages were stained with tears and blood, but the text was still legible. "May God forgive me for what I've done. I could no longer bear to see my angel suffering. Each day it got worse. Edward had 3 seizures yesterday. Eleanor won't stop crying. I know it's our fault. The blood is cursed. Generations of sin have brought us here. I tried to love my children the best way I could, but love is not enough against what we've done. Now I understand what my grandmother tried to tell me before I married Joseph. The blood needs new life, she said. But I didn't listen. No one listened. And now my babies pay the price. There is no hope for them in this world. I can only pray they find peace in the next. May God have mercy on our souls." Local authorities investigated the case, but in isolated communities like that one in the late 1930s, such family tragedies rarely received more than a superficial investigation. The official verdict was accidental death, though everyone involved knew it was a clear case of maternal despair culminating in an unimaginable tragedy. Joseph Blackwood never recovered from the loss. In the months that followed, he became even more reclusive, often sleeping in the twins' empty room. Neighbors reported hearing him talking as if the children were still there. A scientific case study. The story of the Blackwood family represents one of the most extreme examples of the impact of prolonged consanguinity, states Dr. Miller. What makes this case particularly tragic is that unlike some isolated communities that practice consanguineous marriages for specific religious or cultural reasons, the Blackwoods seem to have been victims of their founders' paranoia and geographical isolation, leading to generations of practices that resulted in devastating consequences. If you're feeling your heart tighten with this story, you're not alone. Leave in the comments, "The blood needs new life." This phrase from Sarah's grandmother carries a powerful scientific truth that many isolated communities discovered too late. Your comment helps keep this important discussion about the risks of consanguinity alive. The case of the Blackwood twins might have remained just a tragic local episode if not for the arrival of someone who would forever change the understanding of what was happening in that isolated community. In September 1937, only 8 months after the tragedy, a young doctor named Dr. Robert Carlson arrived in the small town of Millerville, the closest to the Blackwood property. Freshly graduated from Johns Hopkins University, Carlson had chosen to work in a rural area as part of a federal program created during the New Deal to bring medical assistance to remote regions. Idealistic and curious, Dr. Carlson soon began to hear rumors about the Mountain family and their strange children. At first, he attributed such stories to local superstition, but when treating a member of the Patterson family for pneumonia, he heard first-hand accounts about the Blackwoods and the recent tragedy involving Sarah and the twins. Uncovering the extent of the problem. As a doctor, I cannot ignore what appears to be a clear case of severe genetic problems, he wrote in his professional diary. If what they say about generations of marriages between close relatives is true, this family represents a significant scientific case study, as well as a human tragedy that could possibly have been avoided with proper medical intervention. Dr. Carlson didn't know that his arrival in the region would mark the beginning of one of the most comprehensive studies on consanguinity ever conducted in the United States. With persistence and patience, he began to build a relationship with the more accessible members of the Blackwood family, primarily with Thomas, Joseph's brother, who occasionally came to town for shopping. His efforts to gain the Blackwoods' trust were extraordinary, comments Dr. Elizabeth Winters, a medical historian at Columbia University. At a time when the distance between rural communities and medical professionals was enormous, Carlson demonstrated remarkable sensitivity, gradually approaching and offering help without judgment. Dr. Carlson's records, later published in the American Journal of Human Genetics in 1952, with names changed to protect the family's privacy, reveal the slow process of discovering the extent of the problem. Initially, he obtained permission only to examine some of the family's children, supposedly for a free checkup. What he found deeply alarmed him. Documenting genetic anomalies. Of the 17 children he initially examined, 14 presented some type of cognitive or physical anomaly: synodactyly, fused fingers, underdeveloped jaws, micrognathia, fused fingers, partial or total deafness, severe strabismus, and various degrees of intellectual impairment. Almost all presented height significantly below average for their ages. The pattern is consistent with multiple generations of inbreeding, he wrote in his notes. The problems observed are clearly the result of the expression of harmful recessive genes that would remain dormant in a genetically diverse population. The concentration of these genes through successive consanguineous marriages has created a high-risk situation for each new child born into the family. Over time, and especially after gaining Thomas Blackwood's trust, Dr. Carlson gained access to the complete family history with the help of oral accounts, birth certificates, and parish records. He reconstructed the Blackwoods family tree, documenting 7 generations of consanguineous marriages, including several unions between first cousins and at least 2 cases of marriages between uncle and niece. What Carlson documented was essentially an involuntary experiment in human genetics, explains Dr. Miller. In isolated populations like the Blackwoods, where marriages between close relatives occur for generations, the frequency of recessive genetic diseases can increase drastically. Normally, these deleterious genes remain hidden because a person needs to inherit 2 copies of the gene, one from each parent, to manifest the condition. When both parents share recent ancestors, the probability of carrying the same harmful recessive genes increases significantly. The tragic extreme. The case of the twins Eleanor and Edward represented the extreme point of this phenomenon. Based on available descriptions and the few existing medical records, modern specialists believe they probably suffered from a rare combination of congenital hydrocephalus, craniosynosis, premature closure of cranial sutures, and multiple other malformations resulting from the expression of deleterious recessive genes. The most tragic aspect of this story is that it wasn't a biological inevitability, but the direct result of social practices that could have been avoided, states Dr. Johnson. Geographical isolation was compounded by self-imposed isolation, transforming a circumstantial tendency into a devastating family dogma. Joseph Blackwood, still devastated by the loss of his wife and children, initially refused to speak with Dr. Carlson. It was only in 1939, almost 2 years after the tragedy, that he finally agreed to talk. The account of this meeting, preserved in Carlson's notes, is moving. I met JB today at his home. The man seems to have aged 20 years in just 2, completely grey hair, distant gaze, hunched posture. The house is in a state of abandonment. When I mentioned the reason for my visit, to discuss the risks of marriages between close relatives, he initially shut down. After some time in silence, he began to talk about the twins. They had eyes just like mine, he said, even though he couldn't speak properly. Edward laughed just like my father. Can you imagine that, doctor, seeing your own father in the eyes of a child who can barely lift his head? And Eleanor, she held my finger with such strength, so small, but with such strength. When I asked if he knew that marriage between cousins could cause problems in children, he replied, my parents were cousins. Their parents too. Everyone seemed normal. How could I have known? This is the fundamental tragedy, ignorance passing from generation to generation, combined with isolation and distrust of the outside world, Carlson concluded. When I tried to explain the basic principles of heredity, he interrupted me. It's too late for me now, doctor, but maybe not for the others. Talk to my brother. Talk to the young ones. And that's exactly what Dr. Carlson did. A legacy of change. In the following years, he worked tirelessly with the younger members of the Blackwood family, helping to establish connections with neighboring communities and educating them about the risks of consanguinity. His work wasn't limited to the Blackwoods. He identified several other isolated families in the Appalachian Mountains with similar, though less extreme, patterns of consanguineous marriages. The 1940s brought significant changes to the region. Subsequent industrialization and World War II led many young people from the mountains to the cities. The construction of better roads reduced geographical isolation. Previously isolated areas gained access to electricity. And perhaps most importantly, medical knowledge became more accessible. The change for the Blackwoods was significant but gradual. Thomas, Joseph's brother, became a vocal advocate against marriages between relatives, openly sharing his family's tragic history as a warning. Several young Blackwoods married people from outside the family, introducing the necessary genetic diversity to the lineage. Joseph Blackwood never fully recovered. He lived as a recluse until his death in 1952 at the age of 64. In his final years, he allowed Dr. Carlson to document the complete family history on the condition that real names would be changed in any publication. Joseph understood, too late for his own family, that their story could save others. "Tell the truth, Doctor. Tell it so that no one else goes through what we went through," he told Carlson in their last meeting. Scientific reference. The Blackwood family's legacy extends far beyond the personal tragedy that befell them. The study conducted by Dr. Carlson, published under the title Effects of Prolonged Consanguinity in Isolated Appalachian Populations, became a reference in the medical literature on population genetics. Although the exact locations and names were altered to protect the family's privacy, the compiled data offered valuable insights into the mechanisms of heredity and the specific risks associated with recurrent consanguineous marriages. Carlson's work was pioneering, states Dr. James Wilson, professor of medical genetics at Harvard University. In an era before human genome mapping, when our understanding of genetics was still rudimentary, he managed to document inheritance patterns and clearly demonstrate how certain conditions manifested with increased frequency in lineages with a high degree of consanguinity. The data collected by Dr. Carlson showed that in the Blackwood family, the incidence of congenital anomalies was approximately 17 times higher than in the general population. The most common conditions included polydactyly, extra fingers present in 23% of children. Syndactyly, fused fingers present in 18% of children. Microcephaly, abnormally small head 12%. Hydrocephalus, fluid accumulation in the brain 7%. Intellectual disability of various degrees, approximately 45%. Congenital deafness, 19%. Cardiac malformations, 14%. What makes Carlson's study so valuable is that he managed to follow the family for more than a decade, documenting how the introduction of new genes through marriages with unrelated people began to reduce the incidence of these conditions in subsequent generations, explains Dr. Carter. Indeed, in the generation born between 1940 and 1955, after the beginning of Carlson's efforts to educate the family, the incidence of congenital anomalies dropped dramatically. Of the 28 children born during this period, only 6 presented any of the conditions previously common in the family, and even these were of a milder nature. A broader lesson. The Blackwood story eventually transcended the purely medical realm, also becoming a case study for historians, sociologists, and anthropologists interested in the dynamics of isolated communities and the impact of cultural beliefs on marital practices. What happened to the Blackwoods wasn't simply the result of individual decisions, but of a complex interweaving of geographical isolation, specific cultural beliefs, and lack of access to scientific information, observes Dr. Johnson. This makes us question how many other isolated communities around the world may be facing similar problems even today. Indeed, modern studies have identified several populations around the world where consanguineous marriages remain common, often due to geographical isolation or cultural traditions. In some communities, the rate of marriages between first cousins can reach 25 to 50% of all matrimonial unions. Modern science allows us to understand the specific risks and quantify them with precision, explains Dr. Wilson. We now know that an isolated marriage between first cousins increases the risk of congenital anomalies by approximately 4 to 7% above the population baseline. This risk, although significant, is manageable with adequate genetic counseling. The real danger arises when these marriages occur repeatedly over multiple generations, as in the case of the Blackwoods. Transforming tragedy. The fate of the Blackwood property mirrors the changes that occurred within the family. The main house, where Joseph lived his last years in seclusion, was abandoned after his death and eventually succumbed to the elements. The lands were divided among the descendants, many of whom chose to sell their portions and move to urban areas. In 1972, Thomas Blackwood Jr., Joseph's nephew and one of the first family members to obtain a university education, established the Blackwood Foundation for Genetic Studies. Using resources obtained from selling part of the family lands, the foundation funds research on rare genetic diseases and offers free genetic counseling for families in isolated rural areas. "It's our way of transforming the family tragedy into something positive," declared Thomas Jr. in a 1975 interview. "If the knowledge that emerged from our family's suffering can prevent others from going through the same, then something good will have come from all this." The twins, Eleanor and Edward Blackwood, whose brief and difficult lives catalyzed such significant changes, were buried in a small family cemetery on the property. For decades, their graves remained marked only by simple stones. In 1997, on the 60th anniversary of their deaths, the family descendants erected a granite monument with the inscription, "Eleanor and Edward Blackwood, 1929 to 1937. Their brief lives brought light to what was in the shadows. May their legacy be knowledge and understanding. A lasting impact." Dr. Robert Carlson continued his work in the Appalachian Mountains until his retirement in 1965. His study of the Blackwoods and other similar families led to the creation of specific educational programs for isolated communities, addressing not only issues of consanguinity but also other common health problems in these populations. In 1983, a documentary produced by PBS titled Isolated Lineages, The Genetics of the Mountains presented an anonymous version of the Blackwood story, bringing national attention to health issues in isolated communities. The program, which won an Emmy, was credited with stimulating significant improvements in rural health services. The Blackwood story, although deeply tragic, also represents a powerful example of how scientific knowledge can transform destinies, concludes Dr. Winters. What began as a narrative of isolation and ignorance transformed into a catalyst for education and change. It's a reminder that even in the darkest circumstances, there is potential for learning and growth. Today, the descendants of the Blackwoods are scattered throughout the country, many of them without fully knowing their family history. Those who do know carry with them not only the memory of the tragedy, but also the pride of how their family eventually embraced knowledge and worked to transform their legacy. As Dr. Carlson observed in his final notes, human history is full of examples of how ignorance can lead to suffering, but equally abundant are examples of how knowledge can redeem even the darkest chapters of our lives. The Blackwoods exemplify both. If you watched until here, it's because you liked this story. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until here, so I can get to know you and know who really enjoys the stories on this channel." Don't forget to leave your like and share this video with people who might be interested in these hidden stories of American society. Your subscription is fundamental for us to continue revealing these cases that history tried to forget. Science and history have much to teach us about the consequences of practices such as consanguinity, and it is our duty to bring these lessons to light.